So, Prince William and Catherine have apparently confirmed that Queen Camilla was ordered out of Windsor Lodge, and the way everything unfolded is far stranger than most people realize. For weeks, Camilla had been behaving as though the residence belonged to her permanently. She wasn't simply staying there or using the property, she was acting as though she had complete authority over it. Expensive renovations were being approved, long-serving members of staff were being removed, access for certain family members was being restricted, and guests were being given the impression that Charles had effectively handed her the keys for good. And at first nobody openly challenged her. That silence gave Camilla room to continue. But then Catherine apparently noticed something Camilla never expected anyone to question. Several personal belongings connected to Queen Elizabeth and Princess Diana had disappeared from the rooms where they had always been kept. They hadn't simply been misplaced, and they weren't being claimed by another member of the family. They had been wrapped, labeled, and moved into storage under instructions that reportedly traced back to Camilla's office. William had not approved the move. Catherine had not been consulted, and the wider family had not even been informed, until one frightened member of staff finally decided to speak. That one disclosure changed everything. What had initially looked like redecorating suddenly appeared much more serious. It looked as though someone was attempting to erase the identity of Windsor Lodge and replace it with their own authority. Portraits were moved, guest rooms were reassigned, family arrangements were cancelled without explanation, and staff members who questioned the instructions were told that the residence now answered to the Queen. Now, before we continue, if you're enjoying this royal breakdown and want more updates as they happen, make sure you subscribe to Crown Watch. It only takes a moment, and it genuinely helps us continue covering these stories. Because what happened next turned a private disagreement into something much bigger. Catherine didn't explode when she discovered what was happening. Instead, she did something far more effective. She requested the records. First came the storage lists, then renovation requests, then access instructions, and eventually written objections from household administrators. One warning was especially important. It clearly stated that certain objects could not be moved without family approval. Camilla's office received that warning. The move still went ahead. And that was when William became directly involved. He learned that one sealed box contained something connected to Diana, an item he believed should never have been moved without his direct knowledge. For William, this was no longer about furniture. It wasn't about room assignments. It wasn't even simply about renovations. It had become a question of family memory, palace procedure, and the actual limits of Camilla's authority. He wanted one answer. Who gave the final order? The paper trail did not end with some junior assistant. It reportedly moved through Camilla's private office, past two separate objections, and eventually became part of a chain of instructions treating Windsor Lodge almost like her personal territory. And then the situation became even more complicated. Royal household resources had apparently been used to pay for changes that had never received proper approval. That discovery placed Camilla in a position that status and ceremony could no longer easily explain away. Catherine still tried to prevent the dispute from becoming public. She sent a private message asking Camilla to restore the removed belongings, reverse the access restrictions, and pause the renovations until the family could review everything together. But Camilla's response was cold. She reportedly said Windsor Lodge now fell under her authority. Catherine should focus on her own household. That response caused even more damage. Catherine had approached her privately because she wanted to avoid humiliating Charles and creating another family division. Instead of stepping back, Camilla dismissed her and continued. Within days, more staff were reassigned, another family visit was cancelled, and a new set of instructions described the lodge as Camilla's permanent residence. But permanence requires proof. So when William demanded the original occupancy documents, palace officials expected to find a signed grant, a lease amendment, or some written order from Charles. They found none. Instead, they uncovered a conditional arrangement, one that depended on continued family approval and proper use of the residence. And buried inside the wording was a clause that Camilla's office apparently had not considered. If property, staff, or royal resources were misused, the arrangement could be withdrawn. By the end of that evening, William and Catherine were no longer simply asking whether Camilla had gone too far. They were preparing to prove it. Catherine gathered every warning, every invoice, every storage list, and every cancelled access notice into one file. William ordered a full review. And somewhere inside Windsor Lodge, while Camilla continued behaving as though nobody could challenge her, officials had already begun examining the clause that could ultimately remove the residence from her control. Catherine's first instinct was not retaliation. It was containment. She understood how quickly a private disagreement could become a public spectacle, and she knew Charles would be placed directly in the middle the moment Camilla felt cornered. So Catherine chose the quiet route. A private meeting was requested, away from staff, away from cameras, and away from the people already whispering through palace corridors. The meeting was brief. Catherine raised the missing belongings first. She explained that several objects connected to Queen Elizabeth Elizabeth and Diana had been moved without consultation and that staff changes were beginning to affect family access. She did not threaten Camilla. She did not accuse her. She simply asked that the removals be paused until William and the household administration could review what had happened. Camilla did not retreat. According to the account surrounding the dispute, she responded with the confidence of someone who believed the matter had already been settled. Windsor Lodge was now under her authority. The staffing decisions were hers. The renovations were hers. And Catherine should focus on her own household instead of interfering in arrangements that no longer concerned her. That sentence changed everything. Catherine had approached the meeting to prevent humiliation. Camilla apparently interpreted that restraint as weakness. There was no apology, no promise to restore the possessions, no willingness to reconsider. Instead, Catherine was left with what sounded like a warning disguised as a dismissal. Step back or the situation would become even more uncomfortable. But Catherine did not step back. Over the following days the restrictions became tighter. A family visit approved weeks earlier was cancelled without explanation. 2 long-serving employees were told their positions were under review. A guest suite previously used during family gatherings was reassigned for Camilla's private visitors. And new aides began checking names at the entrance even when those names belonged to people who had entered the lodge freely for years. The message was unmistakable. Camilla was building control before anyone could question whether she actually had the right to build it. Inside the lodge the atmosphere became increasingly tense. Staff members stopped speaking openly. Instructions were given verbally and then repeated through private messages rather than the usual administrative channels. Some employees obeyed because they feared losing their positions. Others quietly began saving copies. Catherine did the same. Every cancelled arrangement was recorded. Every staffing change was dated. Every access request was placed beside the response it received. Storage lists, renovation notes, security instructions, and the names of those carrying out each order were gathered together. What had begun as a family disagreement was becoming a documented case. Then a former lodge employee came forward with information that pulled William directly into the dispute. The renovations were apparently not being funded entirely through Camilla's private office. Invoices showed royal household resources had been used for alterations that had not received full approval. Some payments were attached to broad maintenance codes. New furnishings were described as necessary replacements. Decorative work appeared under structural maintenance. And staff assigned to official duties were reportedly being redirected to support Camilla's private arrangements. That was no longer simply a matter of taste. It was a question of authority. When William saw the records, he did not respond with the explosive anger Camilla might have expected. He became quiet. He read everything. Then he began asking questions. Who approved the payments? Who reassigned the staff? Who authorized the storage of belongings connected to Diana? And once again the answers pointed toward Camilla's office. William then requested the original documents governing Windsor Lodge. Not summaries. Not explanations from aides. The actual records. He wanted the ownership information, occupancy terms, funding conditions, and every amendment connected to the residence. Palace administrators began searching. At first Camilla's circle reportedly assumed the review would prove her position was secure. They believed Charles had given her broad authority that William might object but that he could not reverse the situation without openly challenging the king. Then an archivist discovered a line buried inside the residence file. The wording did not describe permanent ownership. It did not grant Camilla an unrestricted lease. It referred to a conditional family arrangement, one dependent upon continued approval and proper use of the property. And beneath that wording was another clause. A clause dealing with misuse, unauthorized spending, restricted access, and the ability to withdraw occupancy when family property was treated as personal territory. Camilla's office apparently had never properly accounted for it. William still did not confront her immediately. He waited. He wanted the occupancy documents checked against the funding record, staffing orders, access instructions, and the orders that moved family possessions into storage. He wanted no gaps, no easy denial, no way for the situation to be dismissed as a misunderstanding. By the time the meeting was finally arranged, he had seen enough. Camilla entered expecting a discussion about procedure. William made it clear that the discussion was about conduct. One document after another was placed before her. Cancelled visits, reassigned employees, renovation charges, access restrictions, and the storage order involving belongings connected to Diana. Then William asked the question Camilla had avoided. What gave her the right? Camilla did not answer with a document. She answered with status. She reportedly argued that the residence had been placed at her disposal, that the household understood her position, and that Charles had no objection to the changes. In her view, that was enough. The king's approval did not need to be written down every time a staff member was replaced or a room was altered. William disagreed. He reminded her that Windsor Lodge was not simply a private reward. It carried family history, official costs, protected belongings, and arrangements involving more than one household. A verbal understanding could not erase written conditions. And it certainly could not justify moving possessions connected to his mother without informing him. That was when Camilla changed tactics. She warned that pushing the matter further would embarrass Charles. A public dispute over the lodge would make it appear that the king could not control his own family. It would create headlines and raise uncomfortable questions about who truly held authority inside Windsor. William understood exactly what she was doing. Back down and the family avoids the spectacle. Continue and he could be accused of creating it. He continued. William ordered a review of every decision made since Camilla began treating the lodge as her permanent residence. Occupancy, security, staffing, spending, maintenance, guest access, and the removal of belongings. Nothing would be accepted simply because of reputation. Every claim required proof. Catherine became central to that review because she had preserved the written objections. Some warned that long-serving employees could not be removed without consultation. Others questioned maintenance accounts being used for private alterations. One message specifically requested that family objects not be moved until their status had been confirmed. The response was brief. Proceed as instructed. That line changed the situation completely. Camilla's office had been warned. It chose to continue. More records followed. A security note showed members of William's household on a restricted access list. A staffing memo described rooms previously available for family visits as being under the exclusive direction of Camilla's aides. An invoice showed work had been requested before approval. Piece by piece the pattern became impossible to ignore. This was not one isolated mistake. It was a system. An administrator who had attended an earlier planning meeting provided another revealing detail. Camilla had spoken about the lodge as though its future was already settled. She discussed new guest arrangements, a revised staff structure and rooms that would no longer be available for shared family use. When asked whether permanent authorization had actually been received, the response was essentially that nobody would challenge the Queen. The entire plan had been built on that assumption. William's review challenged it. By the end of the investigation, officials reached a conclusion Camilla had not prepared for. Her position at Windsor Lodge was not protected by ownership, a permanent lease, or an unrestricted royal grant. She had been permitted to occupy the residence under conditions requiring proper use, shared access, and respect for its family purpose. And the documents gave the household authority to intervene when those conditions were broken. William requested one final verification. Could the clause be enforced without Charles signing a new order and without Camilla's consent? The answer came that evening. Yes. But there was another discovery. Catherine's file showed that Camilla had received 3 separate warnings before the review even began. Each warning explained that her authority was conditional. Each asked her to reverse a decision. She ignored all 3. At that point, the palace was no longer deciding whether Camilla had misunderstood the arrangement. It was deciding what to do about someone who had been warned, understood the limits, and continued anyway. Catherine then arranged the evidence in sequence. First came the room plans, then staffing schedules, then storage records. After that came security instructions, invoices, and correspondence showing how objections had been handled. Not answered, not discussed, overruled, ignored. One photograph immediately caught William's attention. It showed a sitting room before the alterations. A second photograph taken only days later showed the same room stripped of several family pieces. Replacement furniture had already arrived. A new portrait had been placed above the mantel. The room no longer looked shared. It looked claimed. That was the point. The changes were not random. They followed a pattern. Camilla's private guests were given priority. Her aides controlled access. Staff connected to the old household were moved away from key areas. Objects linked to earlier generations were removed from view. Every change made Windsor Lodge feel less like a shared family residence and more like an extension of Camilla's private court. Catherine understood something important. Camilla's earlier comment about focusing on her own household had not simply been frustration. It reflected a plan that was already underway. William and Catherine were not merely being asked to accept new decoration. They were being pushed outside a residence Camilla appeared determined to control completely. Then came the strongest evidence. A long-serving employee finally came forward. The employee had been present when the first storage instructions were discussed and had watched concern spread among the older staff. Nobody wanted to challenge the Queen. Nobody wanted to lose a position they had held for decades. But one instruction had seemed too serious to forget. The employee had kept a copy. It was signed. The document ordered several protected belongings to be removed and instructed staff to complete the transfer before the next scheduled family visit. The timing was critical. The objects were not being moved because of an urgent repair. They were being moved before William and Catherine could see what was happening. And Catherine found the warning attached to the order. It had been sent 2 days earlier. It stated that the belongings required consultation and that no transfer should happen until ownership and family access had been confirmed. The removal instruction came afterward. That discovery destroyed the final credible argument that this had all resulted from confusion. The order had been issued after the risk had already been explained in writing. The atmosphere inside the review team changed. Officials who had remained cautious began speaking more directly. The lodge had been treated as private territory. Royal resources had supported the changes. Family access had been restricted. Still, Camilla's representatives attempted one final defense. They claimed Charles had given verbal permission. That forced the review into its most sensitive stage. Officials searched for anything supporting that claim. A signed letter, a lease amendment, a royal warrant, a note from the king's private secretary, even a diary entry confirming permanent authority had been discussed. Nothing was found. Charles may have allowed Camilla to use the lodge. That was not the same as granting ownership. He may have known she wanted changes. That was not proof that he had authorized the removal of protected belongings, the use of household funds, or restrictions on family access. Private words could not simply erase written conditions. William then asked whether the occupancy could be terminated without creating another constitutional dispute. Legal advisors returned to the clause and tested it against every action documented in Catherine's file. Their conclusion was firm. The conditions had been broken repeatedly, and the household had the authority to withdraw the arrangement. William and Catherine approved the next step. A formal notice was prepared. It listed the breaches, ordered unauthorized work to stop, restored control to household administration, and required Camilla's private staff to leave the residence. Then came one final line. The keys had to be surrendered by a fixed deadline. When the notice reached Camilla, the reaction inside Windsor Lodge was immediate. Doors closed. Calls were made. Staff were told not to speak. One aide insisted the decision would be reversed before morning. But morning came, and nothing changed. The deadline remained. While Camilla's office searched for someone willing to stop the order, palace officials were already preparing inventories, access instructions, and a security plan for the handover. For the first time, the question was no longer whether Camilla would leave. It was how she would react. The deadline arrived on a Windsor morning, and the vehicle entering through the gates did not belong to Camilla. It carried household officials, a security supervisor, and the inventory team overseeing the handover. No photographers were waiting. No announcement had been prepared. The palace wanted the transfer completed quietly before rumor could turn into something impossible to control. Inside the lodge, Camilla's aides were already moving. Personal files disappeared from desks. Garment cases were carried downstairs. Framed photographs were wrapped and placed beside labeled boxes. One assistant moved from room to room, checking drawers and cupboards against a private list. Another stood at the entrance questioning who had authorized officials to enter before Camilla had finished speaking with Charles. The answer was already contained in the notice. Authority had returned to household administration at the deadline. From that moment, rooms could not be closed to inspection. Items could not leave without being checked. And Camilla's private staff could not remain after the final handover. The officials did not argue. They simply read the terms and began. And that calm made the scene even more uncomfortable. Camilla might have expected resistance that could be turned into outrage. Raised voices would have allowed her to claim disrespect. A public confrontation could have made William appear reckless. Instead, every movement was measured. Every box was logged. Every doorway was opened under written authority. There was almost nothing dramatic for her to fight. Then the first dispute began. A set of silver frames had been placed among Camilla's personal belongings, but the inventory identified them as part of the lodge collection. Her aide insisted they were gifts. The officials asked for documentation. None was produced. The frames remained. Then came a writing desk, 2 paintings, a cabinet containing correspondence from an earlier royal household. Each time the same rule applied. Personal property could leave. Family property could not. Room by room, the boundary Camilla had ignored was being restored. William and Catherine were not present. That was deliberate. Their absence prevented Camilla from turning the handover into a personal confrontation. Yet their authority was visible in every document on the table. Catherine's records had established the pattern. William's review had activated the clause. The officials were now carrying out the decision. Then Camilla entered the entrance hall before midday. At first she remained composed. She asked to see the senior official. She questioned the timetable. She argued that the residence could not be surrendered while discussions with the king were continuing. The official replied that any family discussion would not suspend the notice. The deadline had passed. The occupancy had ended. That was when the restraint finally cracked. Camilla accused Catherine of engineering the humiliation from the beginning. She argued that the questions about staff and storage had only been excuses designed to weaken her position. Then she turned her anger toward William. She claimed he was using Diana's memory to punish anyone who challenged him. The room went silent, but William's response had already been written into the handover instructions. The removal was not punishment for personal history. It followed repeated breaches involving access, staffing, spending, and protected family property. No accusation could change the documented record. Camilla rejected that explanation. She demanded that one private sitting room remain sealed until Charles personally decided its status. Her aide produced a separate key and refused to place it with the others. For several minutes everything stopped. The security supervisor checked the notice. The senior official opened the complete occupancy schedule. Every room in the lodge was listed. There was no private exception, no retained suite, no surviving right of access after termination. The final defense collapsed. Camilla was told that keeping the key would amount to refusing the handover. The official did not threaten her. He simply explained what would happen next. Security would open the room, document its contents and record that the key had not been surrendered voluntarily. The aide looked toward Camilla. She gave a small nod. The key was placed on the table. By late afternoon the personal vehicles were ready. Camilla's staff left in stages, watched by officials checking every package against the inventory. The final boxes were loaded. The entrance hall emptied. At the gates one vehicle paused before finally leaving Windsor. Inside the lodge silence returned, but the palace still faced one major decision. Should it confirm what had happened? Some advisors wanted no public statement. They believed the family could describe the departure as a routine change and allow the story to fade. William and Catherine disagreed. Too many people already knew. Too many records existed. Silence would simply leave room for another version of events. That evening they decided to speak, and what they were prepared to confirm would make Camilla's departure impossible to disguise. William and Catherine chose their words carefully, but the meaning was unmistakable. Camilla had vacated Windsor Lodge. Her private staff no longer controlled the residence. The keys had been returned. The unauthorized work had stopped, and household administration had resumed authority over every room, account and access point. The confirmation spread quickly. Inside palace offices aides understood what the public did not. This had not been a voluntary move. It followed a review that exposed how far Camilla had gone while believing nobody would challenge her. She had treated the residence as permanent. The document said otherwise. William did not celebrate. Instead he ordered the restoration to begin. Staff reopened the storage records and identified every object removed during Camilla's occupation. They worked from photographs, inventories and earlier room plans. Items connected to Queen Elizabeth were separated from general furnishings. Objects linked to Diana were checked against William's records before being returned. One box remained sealed longer than the others. It contained the personal item that had first drawn William into the dispute. The wrapping was still intact, but its label showed that it had been scheduled for transfer elsewhere. Had that employee never spoken, the item might have disappeared into a wider royal collection far from Windsor Lodge and beyond the notice of those who understood its history. Catherine watched the restoration without turning it into a victory display. For her the outcome was never simply about taking a residence from another woman. It was about drawing a boundary. Shared property could not be claimed through confidence. Family memory could not be removed from a room simply because it made someone uncomfortable. And authority still required limits even when the person testing those limits wore a crown. That lesson quickly appeared in the way the household operated afterward. Long-serving employees who had been removed were contacted. Some were offered their former positions. Others were asked to help rebuild the household structure. Guest arrangements returned to neutral control. Private aides lost the power to decide which family members could enter. Windsor Lodge was no longer an extension of Camilla's office. But the victory came with a cost. Charles now faced questions that could not simply be dismissed. How much had he known? Had he approved the renovations? Or had Camilla used his name because she believed nobody would ask him directly? Did he know royal funds had supported private changes? And most importantly, did he know that belongings connected to Queen Elizabeth and Diana had been removed even after written warnings? No clear answer came. The silence protected the king from immediate confrontation, but it did not protect trust. William had learned that family assurances were useless without proof. Catherine had learned that private diplomacy could be mistaken for weakness. And Camilla had learned that status might delay consequences, but it could not erase a signed condition once the evidence had been assembled. The balance inside Windsor had shifted. Staff became more cautious about verbal instructions. Administrators demanded written approval for decisions that had once been handled through private conversations. Security teams reviewed who could restrict access to shared residences. And every household now understood the message. William and Catherine were prepared to challenge anyone who treated royal tradition as personal property. Camilla's departure therefore became larger than one lodge. It marked the moment her authority finally met a limit. She had believed Charles's position would protect every decision. She had believed Catherine would remain polite. She had believed William would avoid scandal. And she had believed staff would remain silent. Every one of those assumptions failed. The fall was built through her own decisions. Had Camilla stopped after the first warning, the dispute might have remained private. Had she restored the belongings, reviewed the spending, or reopened family access, William might never have ordered the investigation. Instead, every refusal added another page to Catherine's file. Every attempt to tighten control created another witness. And by the time the notice arrived, the case against her had already been built by her own actions. By nightfall the restored rooms had been inspected. Windsor Lodge was quiet again, but it was no longer the tense silence that had surrounded the dispute. It was the silence that comes after a struggle when everyone understands that the rules have changed. William and Catherine had not simply removed Camilla from Windsor Lodge. They had established something much larger. That invoking Charles would no longer be enough. That family history could not simply be pushed aside. And that even inside the royal household authority has limits. And if this account is accurate, the confrontation at Windsor Lodge may not be the end of the story. It may only be the moment when everyone inside the palace finally understood just how serious those limits had become.